I'm never not gonna photograph a chipmunk. You know what I mean? Like, I'm a simple man. I see a chipmunk, I take a picture.
Birding can take place anywhere there's birds, that is. And in New York City, there's certainly no shortage of bird species here. In fact, that's what makes birding in New York City so much fun. Matt with B&H here, and in this episode, we're at the beautiful New York Botanical Gardens, and we're gonna photograph some birds. In this episode, we're gonna talk all about how to find and identify birds and the basics for actually getting into bird photography. So let's head in. In this episode, we're going to cover photographing birds in urban environments. We'll cover how to find those birds, planning around your bird photography shoot, and then we'll also cover some of the fundamentals to set your camera up for success in photographing birds. So let's jump into it. So first things first, in bird photography, you have to find your bird, and that can seem challenging. It's almost like there's always birds around, but once you want to photograph them, it's hard to get them up close, and then that's where many of the challenges come in. In bird photography, a couple of the best times of day for you to go out and actually find those birds is going to be in the morning and evening hours, especially in New York City because, well, this is the city that never sleeps, but there's certainly less people at 5 a.m., which is when we're here, which is why my voice is 7 octaves lower right now. The benefit of photographing birds at these times is not only are they showing up more so at these times, it's also the best time to photograph them in terms of the light. So this is when the light is the softest, this is when the light is the most warm, which tends to be the most appealing to viewers in the final image. So I'd recommend making a plan around your bird photography excursion. If the sun is rising around 5:30 a.m., 5:29 is probably not the best time to roll out of bed. So getting out around an hour before would be the best bet. Especially if you're trying to photograph birds of prey. Planning way before those birds actually show up and planning for the best light around them will give you the best final image. So we talked a little bit about planning around the time of day that you'll be photographing them, but how do you find those birds? And then once you find them, how do you actually identify them? And the latter part definitely comes more with experience. As you photograph more and more birds, you'll naturally learn about them. But here are 2 apps to help you both find and identify those birds that you're looking for. Starting with number 1, eBird. eBird is an absolutely fantastic resource. There's also a version that you can use on the web, so you don't just have to use their app, but if you're out in the field, using the app is really, really helpful. What it does is you could add target species and see in the area where they've been identified recently, which is all thanks to other eBirders. And there's also hotspots in the area where you can see a list of all the species that have been identified there in the last 3 days or even greater than that. And you could use that to look at hotspots so you know that when you go to a birding location, you'll actually see a great group of birds, and maybe you'll even see the species that you're targeting. So maybe you're out at the birding location and you hear all of them chirping away, but you're trying to identify which birds they actually are. This is where the app Merlin comes into hand. With Merlin, you can click record and it'll actually record all of the sounds around you. So you'll have to be extra quiet here, and it'll almost immediately tell you which birds are chirping in the area. This is really helpful when you're out there and you're just thinking to yourself, which bird call is that, if you don't know right off the top of your head. And of course, as time goes on, you'll pick up on many of those. So don't worry, I understand that there's a ton of bird species and I'm still learning myself. So as time goes on, of course, you'll learn to identify birds a little bit better. And using those 2 apps definitely helps. In New York City, you could tell how the bird behaviors are affected by some of the traffic noise and general noise of a city environment. They're trying to adjust their pitch to communicate a little bit better with each other because of that traffic noise. And also they'll adjust their scheduling and patterns, again, because of when the traffic actually starts. Let's talk about some of the settings for setting your camera up for success in bird photography. Starting with which file format we're actually going to photograph birds in, and I'm talking about shooting in RAW. RAW is basically a file format where it's uncompressed, or at least it gives you the most amount of information directly from your camera's sensor. The best part about this is that it gives you the greatest dynamic range for your photos, which means that you get more latitude in terms of the lightest and darkest parts of your image. And also for editing, there's just so much more room for things that you can do. Again, adjusting that light and the exposure in your image, adjusting all the colors. And overall, if you spent all this money on your camera, you might as well be getting the most use out of it by shooting in RAW. Next, you're going to want to use continuous shooting for many scenarios. Now that means that you might have to have more card space because you're going to be basically shooting in bursts, which means that there's one photo after the other. For a camera like the OM1 Mark II from OM Systems, that's up to 120 frames per second. That's a lot of photos, so I'm not using that all the time, but if you're photographing birds in flight, that's going to really come in handy. You really get to hone in on some of the birds' behaviors by shooting in a fast, continuous shooting like that. Now you don't have to have the craziest high continuous shooting setting, but having any kind of burst mode is really going to help with your bird photography. When it comes to focusing, if you are manually focusing, first of all, props to you, but second of all, make sure that you're manually focusing on a bird's eye. If you're autofocusing, set your camera to autofocus single or autofocus continuous. I prefer continuous so that all the time my camera is tracking these birds as they move in and out of the frame, and I could use the focus hold button on the lens in order to actually stop the focus continuous so that I can reframe without refocusing.
All right, we got this beautiful blue jay a little ways in front of us, and it's like bathing in this little natural water bath right now, bird bath. And you can see all the water droplets just shaking off it. Really, really cinematic, and definitely a beautiful shot too. Such a vivid color on this bird.
Similar thing when you use backbone autofocus, which we'll be talking about in the next episode of this video series. But autofocus single and continuous are exactly as they sound. Single will basically just lock onto your bird right when you half press the shutter, and continuous will continuously tracking any birds. That means that if another bird comes into frame, it could actually refocus on that bird. So just something to keep in mind as you're navigating bird photography and trying to pick between those two. When it comes to the settings of your exposure, that's where the exposure triangle is really going to come in. We have so many videos on the exposure triangle that you should definitely check out if you're interested in learning more about that. Basically, once you understand that, you'll be able to understand where to set your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. But with bird photography, one of the most important things is going to be shutter speed. And you want at least 1/1000th of a second when you're just getting into bird photography. That way you know you're walking away with a photo that doesn't have any unwanted motion blur. However, some of these birds are a little bit slower, and if you have a static bird, then you can definitely shoot at a much slower shutter speed, which I'm going to be doing throughout this entire series. Your aperture and your ISO kind of follow that, except when you're getting further into bird photography, your aperture is going to dictate how much of the subject is in focus, and if you want the entire scene in the background in focus as well, which is sometimes sought after if you're trying to photograph the entire environment. But for the most part, during the times of day that I'm photographing birds, I find myself shooting with the lens wide open, which means I'm shooting at the lowest f-stop number. And the ISO affects just the overall image, and with very capable cameras nowadays, I oftentimes will shoot with auto ISO so that it adjusts the settings for me. That way I can focus on photographing the bird, focus on my composition without having to really focus too much on the exposure. If you're having difficulty setting up your settings on your camera when you're just getting started, you can experiment with the shutter priority mode on your camera. Basically, you just set your shutter setting. So if you want to just jump to 1/1000th, that way you know that you won't be getting motion blur if your bird is fairly still, and if it's a larger bird that moves a little bit slower, then the camera will handle the rest of the settings. And this is a good way to just get into bird photography, but once you get comfortable with that, then you could jump to the fully manual, so that way you know that you're handling all of your camera's settings. Should you shoot with silent shooting or with your mechanical shutter? For the most part, many of the cameras nowadays are actually implementing electronic shutter only. That means solely silent shooting, or at least you could set it to silent shooting using that electronic shutter. And really, they don't have a significant difference nowadays, except that electronic shutter is able to be much faster. So in bird photography, naturally, that is going to be a huge plus. And also, if it can be silent, we won't disrupt the birds in any way. Another question that often comes up is, should you use the EVF or the LCD screen on the back? And my recommendation is to use the EVF because it's much easier to stabilize the camera by doing that. You basically get 3 points of contact with your body, which makes it easier than having your camera way out there. As you can see, it probably causes a lot more movement. And when you're using such great focal lengths, there's so much more movement in the camera. So my recommendation is to try using the EVF. You can also compose using the LCD and then switch to the EVF to really hone in. And that's something that I often do, is I use the EVF as kind of a way to block out the whole entire world around me. So it's really just you, the bird, and a camera in between. That's really my last point for today is, once you have all of your settings dialed in, your custom settings set, and you understand your camera to its fullest, I'm not saying you have to fully read the manual, but once you get out there and actually use your camera so many times, then that's when your camera really melts away and it's just you photographing these beautiful characters in nature. So now we've talked about our gear and we've covered some of the basics for your camera and finding and identifying birds. Now it's time to take things up a notch. We're heading all the way up to beautiful Acadia in Maine. So excited to photograph some of our target species up there, things like puffins, bald eagles, Arctic terns, and so much more. So come join us in beautiful Maine and let us know in the comments below which city you're photographing birds from. We would love to hear it. My name is Matt, and I'll see you next time.